Someone You Should Know. A program about people you know and even more that you don't. Hosted by Stuart Sax, veteran, husband, father, and grandfather. Now, here's your host, Stuart Sax.
Well, I welcome you back to another edition of Someone You Should Know. We're going to have a good time today. We're going to be we're going to be having a discussion that I think is going to make you think. And every once in a while, it's a good idea to just think about what the topic is. We are brought to you by our good friend, Christine Dean, who is the networking diva. And, as I say almost every week on this show, if you have any interest in upping your game on the internet, your networking, your marketing, whatever your plans are to reach your public in the social media, you need Christine Dean on your side because she can help you up your game. She can help you look at your website and say, hey, everything looks good, or I would suggest maybe you enhance it in this way. Christine Dean, thenetworkingdiva.com. Reach out to her. She's great. And we thank her for being a sponsor of this show and also for producing this show. Thank you very much, Christine. Well, to put this whole discussion into a nutshell, I think I would say that our current judicial system is broken. And I think that I can almost see through the lens that people are nodding their head. It is broken. It just ain't what it used to be. And so I've invited an expert on the judicial system to share his thoughts, insights, and expertise on this subject. James Porfido, I welcome you to the show. Thank you very, very much for joining in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Thank you for having me on. It sounds like a really interesting topic to be talking about, particularly now.
Well, right over your shoulder is your book, Unequal Justice, and I've perused a bit because even on the website there you have an excerpt from the book. We are living in a time, and it kind of frosts my buns that justice just is not being served in the way that I remember 20, 30, 40 years ago when I was growing up. The system seemed to work better then. It's skewed, it's broken, it's disheveled today. And so right from the get-go, I wanted to know your opinion, your insights as to why you feel that we just don't have a reliable justice system today.
Well, there's so many layers to that question, to be honest. I talk about it really from my experiences in the criminal court, having experienced it as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney and being on both sides of counsel tables. So, seeing it from one lens or prism and then seeing it from another lens or prism. And it was very different. And I agree with you. The system does not, quite frankly, work today the way it did previously. And there's been a lot of changes fundamentally and inherent in that. I've always looked at the doctrines that we all as attorneys recognize is that it's particularly in criminal cases, you're innocent until proven guilty and beyond a reasonable doubt. Those aren't just words, they mean something. They have a lot of weight. And it really is the governing principles of our criminal justice system. And having been a prosecutor and experienced it handling high profile cases, then moving to the defense side and experiencing the same system, but from a different side of the table, was very, very different. It was almost like a different experience, quite frankly.
Yeah, you said that you are innocent until proven guilty. And it seems to me that what I have seen is that the defendant in many of these cases is so, I don't know what exactly the phrase I'm looking for, that that person is not being served in the proper way. That it's almost like and part of it may be because we allow cameras in our courtrooms, which I think I've got mixed emotions about that because it then turns it into a reality show. that to me distracts from the purpose of all of the people that are in the courtroom, is because they feel like they are playing to the camera and the theatrics. Have you seen that in your career too?
Most definitely, and I kid around and I say, you know, if I weren't an attorney, I'm really a frustrated actor. So, you know, it is a lot about, you know, the presentation and the production and the theater, let's say, almost. And I feel that to be an effective defense attorney or trial attorney, you need to have that presence in the courtroom. You've got to be able to communicate. You've got to be able to relate and talk to people and have them relate to you on a certain level. So yes, I think having cameras in the courtroom is a tremendous, I don't know, my view on that is a little different, but I think that it does affect the ultimate case itself. Perhaps there's a lot of playing to the camera and maybe theatrics. And I often told jurors, you know, in a case, is that this is not a court, you know, this is not, you know, unsolved mysteries or
Yeah,
something that you see
right.
on TV where, you know, you're going to get, you know, these sound bites and it's going to all be done in 45 minutes. It's not like that in the real world. You know, and that's unfortunately people's experiences when they turn on Law and Order and they watch these crime drama shows. They think it all comes together really quickly, and that's just not how it works. And I think that they're disappointed because they're looking for this forensic evidence or they're, you know, these technical things. You know, maybe there's going to be a video presentation or there's going to be, you know, some expert testifying, and that doesn't always happen.
Well, yeah, and the most important thing is what the jury receives from that court case, because you are arguing for your prosecuting for your client or defending the client, and the idea is all that really matters is the people that are in the jury box, because they're the ones that have to decide, the guilt or innocence of the person. So when the cameras are there, number one, I think it would be a physical distraction, because they physically are there with cameras and microphones and everything to pick up on all of that. But also, it just seems to me that it takes away from the core of what the people in that courtroom are there for. Now, having been on both sides, uh, prosecuting some very high profile cases, especially I believe that you've dealt in some sex crimes and some child abuse cases in your time. And then you moved across the aisle and you became a defense attorney. Having done both, do you have a preference for either? Do you feel that you enjoyed being on one side of the aisle or the other, or were you more effective on one side or the other?
Well, that's an interesting question because you know I experienced it from both sides, and I think it was rewarding to be a prosecutor in a lot of ways because you know you were working for the people. You know the taxpayers were paying your salary. You know, and you felt like you were doing something that really meant something. You know, you were giving back in some way. You know, if somebody were accused of a crime, it was your job to make sure you had sufficient evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that was an obligation, a responsibility I didn't take lightly. And I valued that position. And I feel like I did a lot of good things there. I put, you know, some really bad people away for a very long time, and they deserved to be. And I didn't have any second thoughts about that. And then you know, the things evolved. It changed. You know, I became a defense attorney, and one case really changed everything, quite frankly, and led me to leaving the prosecutor's office. And I'll share that with you. It was a vehicular homicide where a mom of three was killed, and you know, the driver was more than two times the legal limit of intoxication. He had significant reckless conduct, and so much so that people were calling in regarding this driver, you know, driving on the median, driving on the shoulder, speeding, doing more than 85 miles an hour on a local highway, and it was just a matter of time before this impact occurred. I never called it an accident because when you mix alcohol or drugs and driving, It's not an accident. It's predictable and preventable. So, and I was careful not to do that. So the mom was on life support for a short period of time. I got to know the husband. I explained what the law was in New Jersey that existed at that time. It was traditional death by auto law, which carried a maximum, if you had no prior criminal history, of 270 days of county jail and 270 days of community service. So when I explained that to him, he said, look, the outcome, my wife is dead. It's no different if she was shot and killed with a gun or stabbed with a knife. He said, it's still the same result. How can the law be so different? And I explained that to him that, that unfortunately was the law that was prevailing at the time, but we were going to go forward on an aggravated manslaughter, which, just so the listeners understand, it's really the equivalent of a murder without a purposeful knowing conduct. It's reckless, extreme indifference to the value of human life. So we went forward, got an indictment, returned an indictment, went to a jury trial, and ultimately the driver was convicted of aggravated manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years, 10 years without parole. Well, the husband, decided that he was going to make it his mission to change the laws, and he in fact did. The state of New Jersey now has a vehicular homicide statute that carries mandatory state prison, minimum 3 years. Because of his efforts, he got the laws to be changed in 1995. And then he started a foundation to talk to high school students and make them aware of the dangers of drinking and driving and drugs and alcohol awareness. And tragically, he himself, jogging by the site where his wife was killed, was struck by a car and killed. So I immediately put in my resignation to the prosecutor's office, and I took his place on the board, which was doing the public speaking. And I spoke to about 75,000 high school students over 2 years doing a multimedia presentation. And that was my decision to leave the prosecutor's office. And I never handled a vehicular homicide case from the defense. I was careful not to do that. I avoided those cases. And then I saw things a lot differently. I represented crime victims. I had a number of cases where I represented crime victims in very serious cases. Another one involved fatalities of two, a law student. The son was a law student. The daughter was graduating college to be a special ed teacher, and they were killed by a drunk driver. And I got to know the mom and dad, and it really became a search for justice and getting the prosecutor's office to aggressively prosecute the driver. And ultimately, he was sentenced to 5 years and 5 years for each death of each child. And it really ruined the parents' lives forever. Their two children were wiped out in an instant. And it really was all the right things being done and all the wrong things happening, because the daughter, her name was Ashley, went to pick up her brother, Billy, from a bar, and she was going to, because he was too tired, so he made the right decision to park his car, called for his sister to pick him up, and as they were driving home, they were hit by a drunk driver and killed, and it was tragic. So I did a lot of work working with victims, because I had that prosecutorial experience and background, and in that case, I was able to get a lot of news coverage to the case and expose that the prosecutor's office really wasn't doing the job it was supposed to be doing in terms of prosecuting this driver, that the investigation had stalled, and quite frankly, this killer needed to be brought to justice, and ultimately he was. And that was one of a few cases that I was involved in that had significant impact upon me. Another was a homicide case where a young lady came to Seton Hall University to play basketball. She went to a fraternity party, and someone that was, initiating with the gang went in and shot several people, and she was killed. So I represented the family in the prosecution of the killer. I sat with them in the courtroom and explained to them what was happening. They didn't understand the criminal justice system, and I was trying to explain to them each step of the way what was going on. And it was a very difficult situation, as you can honestly imagine. But these were pro bono cases. I just took these on because I became involved in a crime victim law center in New Jersey and worked with crime victims. And that was another part of my career as well.
Is it possible for you as an attorney or any attorney to separate their, personal life really from their professional life? Or do you become so involved in your cases that it becomes a part of your personal life too.
Well, I always viewed my role as a defense attorney is that the people that I represented were really like family members in some way. I took on that responsibility and that passion and that energy and that drive really was to personalize them as human beings and make sure that their stories were told. Some of them, clearly were guilty and the evidence was there to convict them. And then my job was really to personalize their lives, their problems, and try to negotiate a better outcome for them, a better deal, a plea deal, perhaps.
Right.
And a lot of people don't like plea bargaining, but it is intricate to our system. It unfortunately has to be because the system would break down. You can't have every case going to trial. But that was really that was very personally, it had an impact upon me because yes, you can't leave it in the courtroom. You obviously take that with you, and it becomes very personal. And being a father, obviously, of a young man, um, those clients, those young people that I represented were like my own children. And I viewed it that way. I treated them that way, quite frankly.
Something that's always interested me is it, and unfortunately, I guess I would have to say, unfortunately, I probably watch too many legal shows. And so, as just a viewer, you kind of get the feelings of what the courtroom atmosphere is all about. And I'm sure that it's skewed. But this idea of plea bargaining, you see it in high profile murder cases, you see it in a lot of drug cases and everything. Is it as prevalent today as it was, or you know, has plea bargaining always been a big thing in the courtroom to try and get the case over and done and out of the courtroom?
Well, that's interesting to ask that because a lot of what happens in the courtroom is driven by numbers. It's about a system that needs to, be proliferated. It needs to continue, and a lot of times it is about getting dispositions of cases, and the way to get dispositions is to negotiate pleas from the state side and the defense side, and ultimately there's a compromise, there's an agreement that's reached. It may be a downgrade to a charge. um, Sometimes it even results in a dismissal of a case if there's not any evidence to support it, or the person's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then your obligation as a defense attorney is to show your client is not guilty. You've now taken on that burden of proof that the state has. You're showing them through your investigation reports. You do your own separate investigation that it could not have been your client. And that's a dirty word for a lot of prosecutors to say that they're going to dismiss a case. They would much rather take a deal, and no matter what the deal is sometimes. But yeah, I think it's integral to the system because it has to happen for a lot of reasons. One is that there's just a volume of cases, and I think it is more prevalent today because there are not as many cases that go to trial, and I see that happening where there's definitely a downturn in trial cases, cases that actually go before a jury. Those are not the norm anymore. I see more and more cases are being resolved long before trial.
Are are we a sue happy society today?
Wow.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I,
because it just seems that either somebody says, well, if you don't like it, sue me, and they do, or people just file lawsuits. uh I mean, it's like putting butter on your bread. Every time you turn around, somebody is suing somebody for something else, and then that would lead to this, well, let's just settle out of court so it doesn't go into court. But I mean, it are people in general today in the 21st century just suing each other more frequently than they have in the past?
that's my perception, my opinion, that it is, people are sue happy. And there are a lot of frivolous lawsuits that are filed. And I think it's really incumbent upon the system to weed those out and to really hold people responsible for filing these cases that are frivolous, that have no merit. And I know in England, they shift the burden. So if someone files a frivolous lawsuit and it turns out that it's dismissed, you have to pay the costs for the other side's legal fees. And that seems to be I would think, a good deterrent to stopping people from doing such things. I mean,
Mm.
yeah, you're right. Some are legitimate cases, and everybody has a right to someone for legitimate purposes. But if it's not legitimate and you're just suing because you're trying to use the leverage or the arm of the law, there are abuses for sure, and I've seen those cases and certainly have been involved in and experienced those.
We're scrolling your website across the screen right now, porfidolaw.com. And I urge those that are watching and listening to visit the website and see the kinds of high profile cases that James has been involved in and get a better perspective of his viewpoint of our criminal justice system, and maybe help you to determine what your point of view is. Uh, which now leads me to the book that you have written called Unequal Justice. And I want you to take a little bit of time and share with the people that are watching and listening, what was the premise for you to say that we're out of balance here and something needs to be done, and you wrote this book, Unequal Justice.
Yeah, the subtitle is "The Search for Truth to Balance the Scales," and I kind of it's kind of a memoir in a lot of ways. It's about my 35-year career and journey as an attorney and all the kind of the detours along the way, some of the things that I got involved in doing. It wasn't just about practicing law. There were a lot of, different directions it led me. Like I talked about before, representing crime victims. That was certainly something I did. I'm a law professor now and teach a class, persuasion and advocacy. I've done TV, legal analyst jobs on court TV and various media, talking about very high profile cases. And so I kind of looked at it globally. It was really, the book is about my experiences, but I often say I didn't write the book. The book was written by the people that were involved, the stories about the cases. And I talked about, I tried to give them interesting titles, The Babysitters from Hell, The Killing of MM and Death by Prison. These are actual cases of people that I came in contact with. And I was, in a strange way, I'll say blessed to be involved in these cases and try to help in these situations. And then, later on in my career, as I shifted direction and became a defense attorney, I was handling high profile cases on the defense side. And I saw glaring examples of how I felt like it was an unfair fight. Like I felt like the judges and the prosecutors were aligned to put my client in jail. And my job was to keep my client out of jail, negotiate a better outcome, or evaluate the evidence and present the pitfalls or
Right.
the problems or the shortfalls in the case to the prosecutor that they would not see otherwise. And I felt like, for some strange reason, they weren't doing their jobs. And it became my job to be the prosecutor and the defense attorney. So I was looking at my experience as a former prosecutor saying, hey, if I were prosecuting this case, these are the things that you need to cross your T's and dot your I's, and you need to be able to, touch all the bases. And you're not able to do that. So you're not going to convict my client. And then it was like, well, you're just telling me that because you represent this person. No, I'm telling you this because I was there and I did this. And I'm telling you that a jury's not going to buy your theory of the case. And I use that that was to me a very big advantage, having that experience, speaking to a younger prosecutor. Now, a lot of them, quite frankly, were turned off by that. You're being arrogant, or you think you know it all. I tried never to come across that way. I always tried to be humble and respectful and say, look, you really need to think about this case, or really look at your file and evaluate your file and the evidence. There were missing missing pieces of evidence here, or you did the investigation is skewed for some reason. The police didn't look at this issue or that issue. They didn't interview these people or those people. Why not? Why not? These are issues that are going to come up,
Right.
at a trial. And I don't think you're going to be able to provide an answer to 12 people sitting in a box. They're going to be saying there's reasonable doubt here all over this case.
Well, very often you find there's reasonable doubt if it's in a case of a murder and there's no murder weapon found. Uh, that's certainly a key part of a murder trial, is to see if the evidence of that killing was there. Also, how many times have we seen a story of a prisoner who is released after 10, 15, 20, 25 years due to either DNA evidence or something within the trial that sent this person to prison, and then they find out decades later that it was an injustice, and we seem to be seeing more of that, each year now. Is that part of what makes this system broken?
Well, there are so many things you touched upon, Stuart. So many, just in that statement that you
Just
made.
in
And
one sentence, yeah, I realize that.
yeah, I just read a book by John Grisham and Jim Calhoun. The name of the book is Framed, and each Jim Calhoun was involved with this Princeton project, trying to find that people were wrongfully, number one, arrested, ultimately convicted after a trial and sentenced. And it's examples of exactly what you're talking about, where people spent a tremendous amount of time behind bars and they didn't commit the crimes. And there were so many things involved in that. There was prosecutorial misconduct where they were withholding evidence from the
Mm-hmm.
defense, where they clearly knew that this person did not commit the crime, or they were using jailhouse informants that they were paying for testimony before the court, and they knew those informants were lying. These were glaring examples, or the courts were being partisan. They were aligned with the prosecutor, and they were having conversations with the prosecution, aligned with the prosecution without the defense attorney. These, what we would call ex parte communications, where they were meeting with the prosecutor and going over evidence and discussing the theory of the case. That's not supposed to happen. And then you had judges that were steering the case in a certain direction with their rulings. So the jury was picking up on this. So, yeah, this does happen all too often. And there are so many examples of this that are happening today, where the police may start out on an investigation and they focus their energy and attention on one individual, one theory, and they don't ever deviate from that and don't explore other avenues where clearly it might have been someone else. There's another motive or another theory that they don't even think about or explore. And then they become almost like, like stubborn, let's say, or it's
Okay.
about pride.
Right.
You're calling them out that they didn't do their job, and they don't want to be told, hey, that they didn't do the job correctly. So unfortunately, it does happen, and it happens all too often. I know Joe Rogan just had a guest on not that long ago, and I listened to the podcast with a defense attorney in New York who is kind of involved with like a Project Innocence. And he had a fascinating case where he was on the show with a prosecutor who agreed with him on one of the cases and ultimately dropped the case against an individual who was improperly convicted and sentenced. And then they targeted the prosecutor, this local county, I believe it was in Mississippi, maybe Louisiana, I believe it was. They went after this prosecutor and trumped up charges against this prosecutor because they didn't like what he was doing. They didn't like this, that he exonerated this person for a very horrific crime, but there was no evidence to support the conviction. So he did the right thing. And then ultimately he was brought up on charges and kind of chased out of the office. And it's an ongoing case. And I wish I could tell you more about the details. I don't recall them all.
You mentioned earlier that you are teaching now. you're an adjunct professor at Seton Hall. And didn't you do your undergraduate work at Seton Hall?
Yeah, there's some irony there because my first choice for law school was Seton Hall, and I did not get in to Seton Hall Law School. I actually didn't get in. I only got accepted at a law school in Ohio and one in at DePaul in Chicago, and I didn't like the idea of winters in Chicago. It didn't sound appealing to me, so I didn't really want to go there. And so I was waitlisted at University of Bridgeport in Connecticut, and I was just persistent. And I talk about this in the book, actually, is that I was calling there. They had me waitlisted to start in the spring semester, and I really wanted to go right away. I didn't want any lag time between college and law school, so I was calling there. And one day I just got the dean of admissions on the phone, and I convinced him to meet with me for an interview. And after like a 45-minute interview talking about my thesis in college, he said, "Hey, you can start Monday." And I was like, "Monday?" And he's like, "Yeah, you got to get a dorm and you got to get your books." And that's how it all started, really. And I talk about that experience too because I actually got a D+ in criminal law from a professor that was a new professor. She was just out of the Manhattan DA's office, and she was teaching a class on criminal law. And I said, how difficult can this be? This is really where my interests are. And well, I got a D+, but the redemption came in my third year of law school when I took another class, a criminal procedure class with the same professor, and I got the highest grade in the class. So it was redemption on a lot of different levels.
And it's just so ironic that you did your undergraduate work and now all of a sudden uh, you're now on the staff teaching at your alma mater. I mean, that doesn't
Yeah.
happen quite that often.
Not at all. And I tell the students that I say, look, I'm living proof that you guys can just do anything if you put your minds to it. And the class is on persuasion and advocacy, which is really the anatomy of a trial. It's breaking it down from, each stage, the opening statement, direct
Yeah,
examination, cross-examination, introduction of exhibits, and how to get evidence in. And then ultimately an effective closing argument to a jury, how to speak to a jury, one-on-one and captivate them in some way, tell a story to them. So, and a lot of the students say, you know what, professor, I'm never going to be a litigator. And I'd say, well, it doesn't matter. The class is persuasion advocacy. That's life. People are not going to agree with everything you say in life. People are going to have different points of view, but you're going to have to be
absolutely.
able to persuade them and maybe advocate your position and tell them why you think your position's right and maybe they're wrong. Maybe they won't agree with you because people are going to have differences of opinions no matter what. But this is a class that you should be able to take into life, and it will help you navigate, all the things you encounter in life. And it really isn't just about being a trial lawyer.
PorfidoLaw.com. Visit the site and learn more about James. And even if you have a question, you can reach out with your questions to him. I want to ask you a question that I think is important, and the people that are watching and listening to this show probably can relate to. You get pulled over by the police for a traffic violation, could be just your tail light is out and all. What are the rights of a driver? What should you do as a driver if you see those flashing lights in your rear view mirror and you pull over? Because I think sometimes people become very, very inundated with, why am I being stopped, and what do I have to do, and what are my rights sitting in this vehicle?
Well, I mean, if there's a legal basis upon which you're being pulled over, and we could all question that until the cows come home, quite frankly, because so many of these statutes or motor vehicle code violations are so you know innocuous, let's say, like having your license plate covered. New Jersey has a so ultimately these cases end up in court. But my advice is very simple: is always be respectful and assume that you're being pulled over for a legitimate reason. Perhaps I and look. You can't say everything. You're not going to litigate your case on the side of the road with a police officer. You're
Right.
you're not going to win that. You're not going to win that. And the first thing is to diffuse the situation. And it's so much of it is about emotion, right? The police come up, they say, "You want your license, your registration, your insurance." You know what? You don't have a whole heck of a lot of options at that point. You know, you can argue, you can fight, you can disagree all you want, but it's probably going to escalate the situation. And I talk about that because there's a really glaring example of that. Talking to Strangers, a book by Malcolm Gladwell, and it's a really fascinating study about dealing in situations. And one is a case of Sandra Bland, and you could find it on YouTube, the actual encounter with this African American woman who was pulled over by a state trooper in Texas. And she had moved from she had a checkered background, but she was starting her life over and was pulled over. And it all focused around her lighting up a cigarette. She was trying to ease her nerves talking to the police because she had prior encounters and became very nervous. And the police viewed that as an affront to their authority, this officer. So she ended up being dragged out of the car and arrested, and ultimately she committed suicide in the holding cell. And it's just a terrible, terrible example. And the police officer lied about, his background, his experience, saying, I pull over people all the time. And, I find that if I pull them over for traffic stops, I find these big things. And when they researched and subpoenaed his records, that was not the case at all. He was clearly lying. He ended up losing his job. But this woman lost her life over a traffic stop. And it was such a senseless thing. And I really, I read that book, and it taught me a lot, especially about some of the cases that I was handling as a defense attorney. But the first rule of thumb is just be respectful. To try to diffuse the situation as best you can, and assume you're going to walk away with a violation. Just take it and get the heck out of there. You know what? Unless they're asking you, "Hey, I need to search your car," then you have rights that attach. There has to be a basis upon which they search your vehicle. Why? Is there, back now, marijuana is legal in most states now. So the odor of marijuana isn't automatically going to give a police officer the right to search your vehicle. But if you have a joint in your ashtray and he sees that joint in the ashtray and smells marijuana, he can assume safely that you may have been driving and smoking marijuana, so you might
Under
be
the
under the
influence,
influence.
right?
So
Yeah.
then, it's all based upon the situation. So it's very situational, each encounter. But my general rule of thumb is always be respectful. The police officer is doing a job, and I just had an interview the other day, and one of the hosts of the show said to me that she had a friend in Princeton University. She was a professor, and she's African American, and she's instructed her sons to never look police officers in the eyes if they ever get pulled over and encounter a police officer. And I said, I don't know that I can agree with that advice. I said, if you're looking away, it looks like you're trying to hide something. Why not
Right.
look them in the eye and speak to them directly and show them you have nothing to hide? Because so much is communicated through our eyes and the contact we make. I said, I don't know that I can agree with that. I certainly am not African American. I can't talk to the experiences that this mom had, who's a professor, who I'm sure is a very intelligent woman. But I don't know that that's good advice I would give to my son. And I understand, from the prison that you're looking at, you're hearing about, these George Floyd type situations and all this
Right.
police brutality. But, I think by and large, police are out there, they're doing their job, and there's a lot of really, really good police officers. And by and large, the majority of them are those good police officers doing their jobs.
It's probably important for people to know what the rules are in their own state, because if that police officer approaches the car and the first thing he says is, "Please step out of the vehicle," uh, you know, if you have the right to stay in your vehicle and say, "I would like to call my attorney," or whatever, do you have that right to refuse to get out of the vehicle? Or, as you say, just go with the flow and see where it leads?
Well, listen, I'm not saying that you should be compromising all your constitutional rights. We all have inherent constitutional rights. First, against, the Fourth Amendment, the unreasonable searches and seizures, that applies
Right.
to a motor vehicle. Your Fifth Amendment rights as they apply to self-incrimination. and your Sixth Amendment rights as it applies to, your right to counsel. So you have all those fundamental rights. But again, what I say is you're not going to litigate your case on the side of the road.
Right. That's right.
You're, and it could get really bad and it could get worse.
And it can
So,
escalate.
it'll escalate, right? So if the police officer says, I would like you to step out of the car, you can say, well, what is the basis upon which you're asking me to step out of my car? I didn't do anything. And the officer could get indignant and say, you know what, just follow my instructions now. You're not cooperating. I'm investigating. And you could be charged with, obstruction of an administration of law. Listen, there's enough tools in their toolkit. That's why I say you're not going to litigate your case on the side of the road and win. It doesn't happen. I've seen so many experiences of that where people think they're going to prevail in that circumstance. And I hate to say it, but you're kind of at the mercy of dealing with the situation that you're in, and being smart about it as best you can, and just using common sense.
So you have written a book called Unequal Justice, and that the scales are out of balance. So to kind of wrap up our discussion, I would like to ask you, do you think our system is beyond repair?
I don't think so. I don't think it's beyond repair, but I wish I could say that I offered all these great suggestions for how we can make change and facilitate change in the system. So much of it, quite frankly, Stuart, that we talked about is about biases, walking into the courtroom. And, we certainly have witnessed that or experienced that recently, where judges should recuse themselves from cases if they have a political interest or a bias. And I always say, look, all you want is a judge that's fair, impartial, neutral, and detached. That's the function of the court. Now, you want from a prosecutor, they're not in the job of getting convictions, they're in the job of justice, searching for justice. That's what their function should be. And as a prosecutor, that was my goal. I would always say, and I talk about it in the book, really is, I represent you, the taxpayer. Am I comfortable representing you, saying this is a prosecution that's warranted under the law? We're going to invest a lot of time and energy in this prosecution. Will you sit there and say, yeah, I'm willing to pay you for that? You might say, no, I don't think that's worth your time, energy, and attention. Let's focus on something else more serious, more significant. And that was kind of my rule of thumb, and then I had to ask myself, look in the mirror and say, do I have enough evidence to convict this individual? And if I do, then I have a job to do. And that is to bring this individual to justice. And justice may be a conviction in the case, or it may be bringing this individual to trial and having a jury make a determination.
James, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to share your knowledge and your expertise with the people that are watching and listening to this show. You have an incredible background on both sides of the courtroom, and I think that's what makes you so interesting as an individual, is because you've seen the system from both sides, and that's why you recognize that maybe it is just not as balanced as it used to be and as it should be. So I thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much, Stuart. It really was a good conversation. And certainly there's so much more to talk about.
Absolutely. Well, I close my show with Oscar Wilde, "Be yourself because everyone else is taken." And I leave you with that thought again. I invite you to join us for another conversation next week. And again, a big, big thank you to James Porfido. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Someone you should know.